In defending and covering, probably one of the most important aspects to get over is you don't have to tackle to win the ball. You can see our defender is in a sideways position and a crouched position. So he can actually win the ball without going and physically knocking the opposition player over. Following this, we can see an example, I'm sure you see it a lot on the fields in America, of a player committing himself, actually running at the attacker, and this just gives the attacker every chance to take on the defender and go past him.
So in other words, he really shouldn't commit himself.
Exactly, that's very important. And here we've got the practice 10 by 10 square, and the defender plays the ball to X, who's the attacker, and he tries to beat him. Remember what we're trying to coach, defending. And here the little lad does an excellent job of getting the ball away from the attacker, but he hasn't actually knocked the attacker over. What we'd like to show now is actually the covering defender. You can see here with a dotted line that when the player takes on the first defender, he has to knock it into the space where the second defender is, because of the body position. The second defender does quite well. This example, you can see that the covering defender is in a poor position. He's not actually covering the first defender at all. And when we play on, we can see what results. Gary, I think it might be well worthwhile here pointing out how it's important that we've built the concept with only a few players and how we should actually develop on to give the whole picture.
I think that's a fair comment, and I think one of the things that, as I look at this monitor with lines going down the middle of it, I can imagine what our viewer may be doing with it. What we got to realize is that defending, where two people depend on one another, which is interchanging of variables within a concept, is very difficult for the lower end of the concrete operational child. The upper end of it, the kids are beginning to grasp this concept. But there again, here we're in a controlled setting. There's only 3 variables. We got a line, we got cones, we have a coach controlling it, and the kids are beginning to grasp it. What we find in this country, again, is that many of these kids never get any of this opportunity. They're thrown right into a league. They're thrown into 11v11 in a big space with many variables, and it's no wonder that they never really truly grasped not only the techniques, but even a more complicated process such as defending.
So the way we build up the numbers and the areas to finish up with 6 and 6 games, that's the way obviously for success.
Yeah, and the biggest thing we have to realize is that's the way the brain develops. That's the way the brain assimilates information, from few variables to many variables, from small space to big space, to simple technique to the development of skill under pressure. There's a progression. The coaching associations have known that for years. All I'm doing is explaining the why. Let's return.
Here in diagram 2 is an example of how we can progress on. We've got 2 defenders designated by the D players playing against an X in a 20 by 10 grid.
I think it's important to realize here that earlier, Derek, I said that these kids would struggle to do this, and you're going to see a good example of how to do it. But what you got to realize, it's good coaching. We set up exactly what we want, and that's the only way that these kids have a chance to making some success at later on.
Here you can see that the second defender has come in and tried to block off the only route. The first defender is showing him the only place he can go. The attacker loses possession and the second defender does a perfect job of intercepting the player.
It really is a good job, isn't it?
Let's move on to a small-sided game situation. Here we can see in diagram 3 we've got a 30 by 20 yard area. We've got 2 attackers, X2 and X1, and 2 defenders, D1 and D2. And they go in one at a time, D1 against X1 and D2 against X2. The coach controls the situation by rolling the ball in. Here we can see the defender firstly shows the attacker the wrong way, showing him towards the goal. Also, because he tries to correct this and show him the other way, in the midst of that he gets caught in a square position and gets beaten. The attacker goes on and gets a shot at goal. Let's look at the second example. Here he gets sideways, he shows him away from the goal, nice low defensive position. making the attacker go one way only. He goes in and with the leading leg makes an interception. It's an excellent example of delaying the attacker. We can now progress to 2 versus 2. Here when we freeze it, we can see that D1 has pressurised the ball and D2 is covering D1 but also ready to push on his player when the ball's passed. He pushes on and due to that pressure the attack gets broken down. We now move on and put these isolated skills into a functional practice, into the related area of the field, the final third. You could see there the way the second defender had covered because the first defender had only allowed the attacker to go to one area. Here the children in the same practice, and with the pressure applied by the 2 defenders, the attacker gives the ball away. It's important that we put our young children into these functional situations. We'd like to move on now and look at probably one of the most enjoyable techniques to teach, and that's shooting.
Shooting is a very important aspect of the game, obviously because goals win matches, and that's the way that we're going to score with the shots. And we find that many shots are off target, and that's usually down to poor technique. So we need to do a lot of work on the technique at a young age. So the key factors for shooting are as follows. It's important to strike the ball with the laces, with the toe pointing down and the non-kicking foot pointing towards the goal. As they strike it, getting the knee over the ball and the body over the ball, because that enables us to keep the ball low, and that's more difficult for the keeper to save it if it is on the ground. When we strike it, we want to strike the ball through the mid-line. That also keeps the ball low. We also find that many shots, as we've said before, are off target, so really we need to put an emphasis on accuracy before power.
Here we can see the actual technique close up. We've mentioned lots of key factors here, but it's very important that we introduce them one at a time to children, otherwise they'll just be overpowered with the whole thing. But there's a very good static picture of what we're looking for.
Very important to realize that children have a difficult time commanding 2 or 3 commands, let alone 7.
And here's how we start working on the technique. We have 2 players marked X just shooting the ball to each other through a goal. Once again, we're looking for success. All we're working on is the technique.
One of the things that I'd like to bring out in this point is that technique is normally taught in pre-operational stage, but you got to remember that since this is such a complex process, we're still emphasizing technique here before we even get to skill and adding pressure, as you can see here by our coach, who literally has to put their foot around the ball.
To move on again, here's a further practice, and what we've done is made it a little bit more enjoyable for the children with a goalkeeper in. Here our coaches demonstrate the organisation of it. The player serves the ball to the side, he comes in and strikes the ball, ideally low. The opposite end of the grid, the players act as feeders as well as shooters, which makes the whole organisation of the practice work. What you may ask is, why don't we do this into a real goal? The reason is that if we do set this up, we have lots of those little grids set out, and that means that they have lots more practice. If we line them up, it makes it very, very difficult. They don't get enough practices to improve their technique. Gary, what we find interesting here, and if you could point it out, is there's a problem here with the serve, and if it's not a good serve, we're obviously never going to get the technique practiced. Can you help us anyway there?
Well, I think, again, it's characteristic of what we're trying to do. We have our aspirations that we're trying to teach shooting, and what we're seeing is the true life children struggling even to set the practice up where we can get any success. They just don't understand.
This is the same practice, just with a slight alteration. Now the ball's been served from a different angle. X2 and Y1 become the servers, playing it out away from the goal. We start off making sure that the outside shooters have 2 touches, one to control and one to shoot. Once again, the organisation is shown so that we get lots of shots, and we've got people involved in the practice throughout the entire thing.
So from here, obviously now, Derek, we go to the children.
You can see it's not quite like we've seen with the coaches, but she's controlled it and she's shot and she's got a goal. Definite improvement. Now we develop. We're hitting now the ball first time. We don't move to this until the children are confident striking the ball first time. And here the child comes in and strikes the ball first time, which is a really good effort. Here in diagram 4 we just have a variation on the practice. The serve now is from the side, and you can see there's 2 people either side of the goal. Quite a lot of key factors that we have to look at here. You can see when the ball is struck that the knee is actually over the ball. He uses the laces, the eye is on the ball, not where he's striking it, and the shoulders are pointing towards the target. That allows the player to lock himself into the goal. Ideally, you want the ball on the ground as well. And you can see with the strike that actually when we run on, the ball is struck well along the ground and beats the goalkeeper. What we need to do is put the player taking the shot under a little bit of pressure now. Here you can see the defenders putting a little bit of passive pressure on the player shooting. The thing to remember here is the player shooting often has a lot more time than he thinks he does, so we must make sure he relaxes before he shoots. Now we're going to move into a functional practice for shooting. In this practice, X2 and X3 dribble down outside the cones one at a time, and they cross the ball in for X1 to have a shot at goal. Hopefully we're going to encourage him to shoot into the corners. Obviously we've marked this by putting cones there. What we might ask is, I'm sure that the viewers are asking it, Gary, is most of these shots are going to happen like this, always end up straight at the goalkeeper. Can we explain that?
Yeah, we mentioned in our previous tapes, Derek, about the concept of centering, which we now know after talking with thousands of people around the country that everybody sees this phenomena. What we're going to see in a few minutes is a device that we've created to help, 1, explain what's going on, and 2, how to unblock it. Obviously, this young lad's had opportunity to work on it.
As you can see in diagram 6, the place highlighted is where we want the player to shoot, low to the far post, basically because it's more difficult for the goalkeeper to save it. Here in this practice we've got X2 plays to X1, X1 plays it back to X2 who has a shot at goal. X1 continues on looking to see if the goalkeeper parries the ball out, he can't hold it, he's there to score a goal. Here we've got it, the shot goes in, the player continues on, here you see him highlighted, and he's in a perfect position if the goalkeeper parries the ball out to finish with a goal. This position is called the POMO position, position of maximum opportunity. Here we can see from the other side, this shot goes to the near post. The best we'll get from this, as seen is here, is a corner kick. Here now we have an example of the POMO position working for us. The ball is shot low to the far post, hits the far post and bounces back to the player who's carried on, and he just converts with a goal because he's followed through and gone to the POMO position. Here we've got the children. Shot to the far post, and the player was there. If the goalkeeper had parried it out, he was going to score. We now move to a small-sided game, 1 versus 1. Here we've got a 30 by 30 yard area with 2 goalkeepers and 2 teams, Y and X's. The point of the practice is to get as many shots in as possible to encourage the children to shoot when the opportunity arises. Here in the first example we can see the lad gets the ball, shoots at goal and scores. In the following example we can see the child waits a little bit too long and the shot's deflected. The coach steps in, makes his point, and now, although he misses the target, he still gets a shot in. And it's important to emphasise, if you don't shoot, you'll never score. Here again, perfect example of having 1 touch and getting your shot in at goal. And this is a very enjoyable for the practice. If you haven't got portable goals, you just use cones. That's just as effective as you've seen with that. What we can do now is move into the conditioned game. This really concentrates on shooting again. As you can see from the diagram, we've got 30 by 30 area. The dotted line restricts the players. They must stay in their half of the field. X1, X2 and X3 combine against Y4 and get shots in. Y1, Y2 and Y3 combine against X4 and get shots in at the opposite end. Obviously, what we can do is the younger the children, the shorter the distance. And there just the coach is demonstrating he wants to get a shot in as soon as possible. Here we move to the children, and here is an example of the child not taking a shot when he should have taken the opportunity. We need to go in and coach that when the opportunity arises, he must get the ball as he does here and shoots at goal. As this child does, another shot at goal. In this particular practice, we want as many shots in as little time as possible. We can develop now into a small-sided game 4 versus 4. We've now taken out the restriction of the dotted line so the players can go anywhere in the grid. Same area, same type of game. We just want to get as many shots in as possible. The Y's playing against the X's.
I think it's very good that you started with a line and went away from it, helping kids to understand the distance.
Here we can see the organisation is not as clear as before, but at least now we can, if we need to, go back to the situation we were in before. It's important that children, we try and progress, but we evaluate what we've got. Here now, we've got no restrictions and a shot goes in and he scores a goal.
Obviously, there's some progression.
Once again, he intercepts and scores a goal. I think it's important to note once again that, remember, if you haven't got full-size goals to use, then just use cones. So the game continues pretty straight on. And now the Reds get the ball, dispossess, and they shoot, and it lands right in the corner. I'd like to move on to now technique bending the ball, and we wouldn't introduce this until probably the upper age range in the concrete operational thought. Gary, would you like to make some comments there on the use of the cones?
Yeah, I think very simply, if we would look down the middle of the line where there's the dotted line, we put 2 cones in the center of the field to help that line, and now we've put 2 cones out a bit to create the actual space by which we want the ball to go around. The more they begin to get better at bending it, the more we move out the cones.
Here we can see a picture of the ball, and the highlight comes up of where we want the ball to be struck, just underneath the midline and to the side of the ball, which imparts the spin on it. Both sides, we can use the outside of the foot or the inside of the foot to bend the ball either way. And here we see the coaches just trying to put that into a function of actually bending the ball with the inside or outside of the foot to bend it round a defensive wall. Here we see a young lad doing exactly the same thing. Gary, I believe that we'll go and look at the auto goal now. And when I first saw the use of this implement in coaching, I've sort of doubted it because I felt, how does this relate to the game situation? And I think it'd help certainly our coaches out there watching if you explained quite a little bit about it before we actually look at it on the screen.
Yeah, you're not the only person that thought I was a bit mad when I was out with my beginning sheets and things like that. But what we've all known for years is that we've all seen kids shoot the ball to a goal that's 8 yards wide and 8 feet high. And where does it always go to? I've asked that question thousands of times, and everybody yells out, to the goalkeeper. We laugh about it, we've seen it, and yet we continue to keep doing it, which is an interesting part about human behavior. What we did was we realized that a concrete thinker at this stage focuses in on a concreteness, and what you're about to see is the concreteness in this situation is a goalkeeper with a big red shirt on, and what that does is forces the child to focus in. What we tried to do is create a device that did the reverse of that, where it focused the concreteness out. The auto goal then did that. By placing it in the goal as the child looks up, they actually focused out and did exactly what we're trying to do in our other instruction about shooting, by shooting low into the far post. So we've accomplished a lot of things, but the biggest thing is it's helped us to understand a better way to teach. That's what it's all about. Let's continue on, if we may, and follow along with what the actual autogoal does.
Great. Here we can see an excellent illustration of why we need the auto goal. This young lad here is striking the ball, as Gary pointed out earlier, directly at the goalkeeper. That's what he's focusing on. The major thing for him is the big thing in the middle. So we use the auto goal to get the child to focus outside, away from the middle of the goal. Ideally we want them to shoot low to the far post. And you can see with the use of the auto goal, now the lad is focusing on the corners as opposed to the middle of the goal. And we're getting far more success with the lad shooting into the corners. The next thing we have to do is obviously progress on from here and introduce a defender. Here you can see coming up, the defender's been introduced, and we've still got the auto goal in there, and it's applying that little bit more pressure to the child, but still now is aiming to the corners. Now the auto goal's taken out, and we can see a distinct improvement. The lad is now focusing on the corners as opposed to earlier focusing on the goalkeeper. An excellent shot there. And the last piece to the jigsaw is to introduce the defender again, and still the lad focuses on the corners. I'd like to do some heading now. I think it's important to point out here that let's coach heading in small little bursts. Let's not do too much of it. Basically because we don't want the children to really go away thinking they've done an hour of heading and they're going to have a bad head. Next time they come to do heading, they're not going to be too keen on it.
I think you're right, Derek, and I think it's important to realize that what we just seen is what we want. And how do we get there is the next point that we need to make.
Here we can see the coach demonstrating the surface. Use the forehead, and he's actually rolled the ball around his head to make sure that he's going to feel comfortable, and it's important the children do that as well. Obviously there's some key factors in heading the ball. Here we can see he's using all his body to power the ball away. Attacks the ball, which is also very, very important.
I think number 3, in terms of power from the upper body, is something that, again, we're looking at for older kids to do and more developed children. Again, important to build the picture of what it is that we're looking to do it. Now it's important for us to break it down and do it in a way that can help children grasp the concept.
And this is demonstrated perfectly here by, let's just start with a child just feeling happy, heading the ball a couple of times. In the diagram shown, we're going to show you how to develop the technique of heading the ball. S serves the ball to X1, and we remember that we've got them set out as we have here. The coach is rolling the ball, and all he's doing is heading it out of his own hands. Makes him feel good about it.
Yeah, I think the question that one could ask here is, what in the world are they doing on their knees? That's not the way we play the game. You got to remember that different parts of the body really interfere with the child's development. So what we do is remove the part of the legs at this point to give them the opportunity to head the ball just from their waist up. And here we see a perfect shot of a child actually going through the ball and doing that.
Important, as you pointed out, that he's following through the ball to force the ball away. And although he's not using his legs yet, at least we're building that concept with him. I think we see in the next example that the child uses the correct surface, which is great. He uses his forehead, and he keeps his eyes open and watches the ball. But what he doesn't do is follow through. But let's concentrate on what he did well. We can always build him into the final thing.
This is so typical. Kids can't put all the parts together of their body. It's a thinking process, and it needs time to develop. Here's a good example, Derek. Why don't you explain this one?
Yeah, this child is obviously feeling really confident about attacking the ball. You can see he uses his whole body, throws himself at the ball, and it powers it away. Obviously, he's a little bit more developed, a bit more confident in comparison to the last lad that just worked.
And he doesn't have to think through anymore the head, the shoulders, the waist. He's now confident enough that he has all those put together, and thus becomes the skill.
Let's try and break it down now into the two distinctive areas, attacking heading and defensive heading. Let's look at attacking heading. Here's an example of the coach just demonstrating what we're finally looking for so that the viewers can get a good picture. And that's something to lead to. Once again, it's good for the children to watch this so they can see it in their mind of what they finally want. You can see the coach has really worked at getting above the ball, and he heads the ball down into the ground because that's where it's difficult for the goalkeeper to collect it. Let's just have a look at another example of this in slow motion.
Just like teaching kids to shoot with their head, isn't it really, Derek?
Correct. Once again, we can't just expect the children to do that, so we have to build it in little steps. Here we've got a practice. S serves the ball to X1, who heads the ball through the goal, and X2 actually is collecting the ball, so we don't waste time fetching the ball. There's an example of it, and the goalkeeper does quite well. I think it's important to note here, just aside, that in these practices, it's important that the goalkeeper tries as a goalkeeper. Then the satisfaction is a lot more.
I think it's also important to realize, Derek, that here we're in a controlled setting, and there's a typical example of what happens even when it's controlled, and here's where a coach has to step in. What would he be telling him now?
Here I think you can see him quite point out to the child, this is where you've got to head the ball, and he gets the child to point to the forehead. The coach actually gets a little bit closer, and now, although that's not perfect, that is night and day to what he did last time. It's important that we focus on what he's done well. Let's move to the functional practice. Here we can see in diagram 3, S, the two S's serve the ball to Y1 and Y2, X1 and X2. After they've headed the ball at goal, they move to the opposite line that they started from, and we work in a 10 by 10 grid. And here this illustrates the practice. Here we want the child to head down to where the white square is. Makes an excellent effort, gets over the top of the ball, heads it down into that area and scores a goal. On this example coming up, you can see the child does very well and gets over the top of the ball, but heads it down directly at the goalkeeper instead of going into the corners. And something we can notice here, the child doesn't get out of the way for the next move. He's just concentrated on his turn, and thus the third header is too high.
It's interesting, as we pointed out in shooting, Derek, that shooting again with their head, they're hitting it to the goalkeeper.
Okay, what we'd like to move on to is just have a brief look at defensive heading.
Yeah, I think very important here to realize is what we're asking a wide range from 7 to 11 years age to get involved in this. 7-year-olds won't have the power, they won't understand it. 11-year-olds are playing in a big game, they need to get involved in it. But it's very difficult physiologically as well as their ability to think it through.
Sure, and I think showing the children the picture of this gives them the final image of what they want to do. And the major coaching points there, we've got to get underneath the ball, we want to head the ball high and wide, and it's the use of the upper body particularly, but also the lower body to get that power to head the ball away. And I think when you see this last example, you can see that it's certainly quite a difficult technique, and obviously put into the game, when you've got players around you, it becomes a very, very difficult skill. Here is an example of how we start the children performing in this. We've got S, he serves to X1, and X1's aim is to head it over the server towards the 10-yard line. And there we've got an excellent example of a lad who is just moving through the concrete operational thought stage, who's getting at least some success, but still at times having a little bit of difficulty with it.
Notice again, Derek, that we haven't added any pressure of defenders or parents or winning or uniforms or referees, and they're still struggling a bit.
Here in this diagram we can show if we've got success at this level, then we can afford to move on a little bit and introduce the defender. But you can see that the defender in this practice is a very passive defender, because once again we're looking for the child to get some success from it. And this last effort, he certainly improved throughout the 2-hour session that we spent with the child.
Yeah, it's good technique, heads through the ball, and obviously is not as bothered by someone even standing there now.
We can now move on to a functional practice for defensive heading. Here we can see in diagram 6, we've got the two servers designated by an S and the defender in front of the goalkeeper. his aim is to head it into the shaded areas, keeping it away from X1 and X2, trying to head the ball high and wide. And here in this first example, you can see he gets well underneath the ball, heads it well high, use of his arms as well, and it does go high and wide. The second example, you can see that he doesn't quite head it away and it drops to the strikers, who manage to get a shot in at goal.